If you're into Japanese music in the slightest, then there's a good chance you've heard of Vocaloid before. Originally starting as a university project before being financially backed by Yamaha in the mid-2000s, it allowed musicians of all kinds to use samples of singers' voices to synthesize and create complex vocal tracks of varying realism. And while it may not have initially been a huge success in its original incarnation, it wasn't long before it took off with the release of Vocaloid 2 and the Hatsune Miku voice bank. However, the idea to make a speech synthesizer that could sing competently didn't just pop out of thin air. There were experiments and proof of concepts, with it dating all the way back to the 60s. In the case of Yamaha, however, their line of speech synthesizers didn't start with Vocaloid like some people might think. It started with a circuit board. Released in 1997 in Japan for 1,600 yen, or just around $200 in the US at the time, was the Yamaha Plug 100 Sing, or just the Sing as I call it for ease of speech. It was one of 3 expansions launched alongside Yamaha's MU100 desktop music synthesizer, alongside the Plug 100 VL for simulating woodwind instruments like the sax and trumpet, and the Plug 100 VH for vocal effects such as vocoding and gender bending. What the VL and VH did aren't all that special now, and in fact are still pretty common, with countless virtual instruments existing for both of those. But the Sing? Yeah, this thing is something special, even when compared against modern speech synthesizers like Ultralounge and Vocaloid. There's a number of things that still make it unique, from the way it synthesizes voices, the form factor, and the customizability amongst other things. So let's take an in-depth look at this interesting piece of history, starting with the packaging. The Plug 100 Sing comes in a fairly nondescript and honestly very uninviting box. With the exception of the somewhat playful looking font used for the name of the board, the rest of this box is incredibly basic and very businessy. It's a very stark contrast from the Yamaha Vocaloids that we're used to now with their vibrant anime-inspired characters, and even then it's a bit bizarre considering that Yamaha was already shipping out synths in vibrant boxes, at least in Japan, and the later Plug 150 modules came with pretty neat packaging as well. Anyways, pop open the box and you're greeted by a decently thick manual which contains information on how to use the synth, a floppy disk containing the 5 demo tunes, a sticker sheet of stickers to stick on devices that are stickable to stickable things, and the expansion board itself. The board itself isn't all that special or interesting to look at. In fact, it's pretty basic, only containing the chips necessary for it to work, with the core to synthesis here being a Yamaha YMF293-F, a derivative of Yamaha's earlier OPL4 synthesizer that was used in some computer sound cards. Once you're done staring at the board and admiring the simplistic beauty of it, installation is pretty standard. Just follow along with the instructions in your plug-compatible synthesizer's manual for installing boards and you'll be good to go. In my case, I'm using a Yamaha MU1000X, which follows the same install procedure as the earlier 128 and the higher end 2000, although you could really install one of these things at anything plug compatible, which means anything from a 1997 MU100 to a 2004 Motif Rack ES will work, so as long as you've got a free plug slot. Anyways, I just popped the back of my MU1000 open, stuck a cable into the connector of the Sing, lined it up on a rail, closed the back up, and after seeing it boot up for the first time without exploding, I was good to go.
Alright, let's power it up. There we go.
And yes, I did put a sticker on, I couldn't resist. Once you have everything up and running safely, all that's really left to do is play around with it, either by listening to the demo songs included on the floppy, and or by trying out some sounds from the front panel. There's 72 stock ones included on the board, 16 male voices, 16 female voices, 5 kid voices, and 35 ones that I guess are best classified as not voices? There really isn't a lot you can do from the front panel here besides make some basic tweaks to the voices, though even that is a bit annoying to do compared to using the full-fledged editor included with Yamaha's sequencer programs. Speaking of which, those are by far the best place to check out the demo songs in the floppy I mentioned earlier. The disc isn't anything special, it's just a standard high-density disc you can pop into any regular old floppy drive, so I'm using a USB floppy drive here. There's 5 MIDI files on here total, one original track by Yamaha, Formanti Night, and 4 covers, those being Haru Yokoi by Yumi Matsutoya, Kore ga Watashi no by Puffy Amiyumi, Kita Sakaba by Hosokawa Takashi, and Toki no Nagare Nimi wo Makase by Teresa Tang. Each of these demos is designed to show off the various capabilities and the flexibility of the board, with special attention being drawn to Formanti Night and Haru Yokoi, the former being an in-house track that shows off some functionality other than singing, and the latter being a tutorial track of sorts that goes with the manual, showing off how to operate the device. So, something that keen ears may have noticed when listening to these demos is that they're not particularly realistic. So I think this is a good time to explain what separates this from Vocaloid and how this thing actually works. Unlike Vocaloid, which currently relies on samples of real voices that are further manipulated by the Vocaloid engine, the PLG100-SG generates all of its voices in real time by using Yamaha's so-called formant synthesis. For some quick clarification, if you're not aware what a formant is, it's one of the key parts of human speech and refers to the frequencies that are present when we speak a vowel. When listening to people speak, we partially rely on these to tell sounds apart and get a better idea of what's being said. The SG board uses two parts, or oscillators, to recreate human speech based on this idea. The voiced oscillator, oscillator 1, replicates so-called voice sounds, sounds which cause our vocal cords to vibrate, and the second oscillator, the unvoiced oscillator, replicates both noise or unvoiced sounds. Things like th and plosives are replicated using this. Both of these oscillators are fed through a filter to create a final sound that sounds convincing enough to be understandable, but it's still obvious that it's not a person singing. Yamaha would later enhance this technology for the only other device to feature it, that being the FS1R just a year later. It's an absolute beast of a rack mount synthesizer, featuring an FM synthesizer core, backwards compatible with the famous Yamaha DX7, and a much more complicated formant synthesis engine that allows for combining two formants, along with individual filters for each oscillator, allowing for much more flexibility than the comparatively limited SG board. From what I've read, and I can't personally confirm because I don't own one and I don't have $1,000 laying around to spend on one, editing one of those things is a chore, which isn't all that shocking, as the SG isn't exactly a breeze to work with either, at least when it comes to lyric editing using the included tool. That tool being Lyric Editor, which does exactly what it says on the tin, allowing you to apply lyrics to MIDI note data through a simple editing interface that just has you typing out basic syllables in hiragana, and once you get done with that, you can do additional editing on them in what's called foray, which allows you to do things like add multiple syllables to a single line to form more complex or longer sounds, add breaths and noises, and change how long it takes for a syllable to fade in, something of which you should pay particularly close attention to. The real trouble comes from getting the interface to cooperate, as it has some very annoying quirks, with the worst one being this. Did you catch what happened there? Let me break it down. If I type in just one syllable, then the note I entered it into goes completely blank. But if I type two or more in, then it works fine and fills in the next. But what if I want to have multiple syllables on a single row, like for ste? Then I gotta edit both fields I just entered. To make this even worse, I can't even figure out for the life of me how to enter syllables with two characters like jo or nya without the software throwing a fit. Can't really circumvent typing in note data either. While you can type out your Japanese lyrics in a specially formatted document and import that option doesn't really work well if you're writing the lyrics as you're making the composition like I tend to do. You also can't access the foray editor without having typed in a lyric first, since it doesn't work on blank fields. Foray itself isn't safe from problems either, with my biggest gripe being the inconvenience of actually selecting sounds. Instead of getting separate rows to pick through the types of Japanese syllables as they're laid out on hiragana charts, you have to scroll through one gigantic wall of text, a task made even more tedious by the addition of extra sounds to the list, and said sounds are ones that I never found myself needing to use, nor have I seen them used in the few user-made MIDIs I found. A simpler way to edit note data and compose at the same time, and the one that was eventually adopted by Vocaloid, is just simply giving the user a separate program with a piano roll that you can enter notes into, which is way more efficient than fiddling with two plugins to do the same thing. But unfortunately, Yamaha never released any sort of updated interface for the SG to make it as easy to use as Vocaloid, so we're just kinda stuck with this unless somebody wants to make something akin to Vocaloid. Outside of the lyric editor, however, working with this thing is mostly par for the course for a MIDI-based instrument. You add dynamics with the expression controller to make the sounds more realistic, pitch bends where necessary, and so on and so on. The only thing that's really non-standard is getting it to stay on time when singing. See, notes need to play a little early sometimes, according to how long they take to reach their peak, so to speak. Which is why I said to pay careful attention to how long a note takes to fade in, because pretty much any sound that takes time to fade in needs to be played slightly earlier than it would normally be in order to be on time. Otherwise, it just sounds wrong. The whole process of editing everything to be on time is painfully tedious, and something that I really wish the lyric editor did automatically, as it'd save a ton of time and frustration. That said, once I figured out all of the quirks and just accepted the weird annoyances of this thing, I found myself getting into a good workflow and working on it, and I eventually managed to finish a short song using the device, and actually had fun doing it. However, regardless of whether you want this thing to sing or just use it as a quirky synthesizer, you'll probably end up checking out the second plugin included, the Easy Editor. This gives you access to changing every individual part of the synthesis process in a very navigable interface, making it a breeze to create all sorts of unique sounds. And yes, you're not just limited to making voice sounds. Like I showed in the demo, the Sing can do a lot more than just make voices, even if that's the primary goal of it, and it's a tad limited outside of singing due to its monophonic nature. Weird, breathy, and atmospheric synths, bizarre and out of this world sounds. There's a lot you can do with this thing despite its limitations, which is apparent even just by spending a little bit of time with it in the editor. So while this thing definitely isn't as flexible as its bigger brother, the FS1R, there is still quite a bit of use for it beyond making Japanese vocal tracks or using it as a robotic background singer. Regardless of what you do here, however, you aren't really going to make it sound realistic or even close to Vocaloid for that matter. The Sing has its own bizarre vocal characteristics that's hard to pin down. In some ways, it sounds strangely human, sometimes more so than some early versions of popular Vocaloid characters like Hatsune Miku, but because of how limited the vocal synthesis features are, it never comes close to achieving the same level of fidelity as a properly trained human voice or finely tuned Vocaloid, resulting in a sound that's as fascinating as it is bizarre, and as far as I'm aware, has yet to be replicated in any capacity. It's also worth noting that the Sing is compatible with all the typical features you'd expect from a product originally aimed to be used with a Yamaha desktop music module, so all of your effects on your module will work on this thing, such as reverb and chorus, which both work splendidly, and insertion effects like distortion, flanger, stereo delay, and whatever else your particular synth has on offer. Something else I want to mention that is, if you're coming to this thing expecting to make it sing English like some people have made Japanese Vocaloids do, please don't. I tried for quite a while to make something decent with it, and for a while I thought I got something out of it. Then I sent it over to some friends and they had no idea what it was saying or if it was even supposed to be saying something, which was incredibly disappointing and heartbreaking to say the least. But I guess I shouldn't be that surprised considering this device was only ever sold in Japan for a short period of time, but even then, there's a lot of Japanese music from the time, and even nowadays, that have some English lyrics spread throughout them, which makes this thing kinda limited even just for making covers of pop music like some users apparently felt compelled to do. And yeah, there was, at least seemingly was anyways, a small scene of people making music for this thing back when it was new. Beyond the 5 included Yamaha demos, there's 2 MIDIs that have circulated the English-speaking web for a while, both of which are covers of tunes from the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion. And you know what? They're both pretty awesome to listen to. I've also seen a couple of ones floating around on old Japanese websites, although their accessibility is all over the place, with many sites being gone due to time and not being archived, or in even more frustrating cases, being on websites that are still up, but have their MIDI links removed, nowhere to be found for unspecified reasons. Whether that be due to some copyright takedowns on part of the Jazz Rack Copyright Collection Society, users not wanting to offer their downloads anymore, or some other thing, is not something I'm privy to, but it is disappointing as I would have loved to hear some other music played back on this thing with my own unit. That said, I did admittedly have a bit of fun downloading random MIDIs off the internet of anime tunes I liked and lazily putting the lyrics on them. It sounds pretty goofy, especially if you ever wanted to hear a Gundam sing Gundam. So, is it worth buying a Plug 100 Sing? Maybe. Sorta. Probably not. There's a lot of things to consider even if what I said hasn't deterred you from wanting to pick one up. First off, as I've mentioned before, this is an expansion board, not a standalone synthesizer. Similar to how Vocaloid requires you to buy the engine and a voice bank separately, you will need to purchase a compatible Yamaha synthesizer with plug support and the Sing separately. At the cheapest, you can expect to spend about $100 for a Yamaha ME100 or ME100R, and keep in mind that because these things are pieces of physical hardware, they will take up some desk space, ranging from very little in the case of the adorably tiny 1U half-rack ME100 to the absolutely massive Motif Classic series of keyboards. Then there's the Sing itself, which can cost anywhere from $50 at the absolute lowest if you have some insane luck or live in Japan, all the way up to about $100 plus shipping and possibly import fees if you need to use a proxy service to import it from Yahoo Auctions Japan. I paid about $100 plus shipping for mine on eBay, which is not the cheapest I've seen, nor the most expensive, but it's the only listing I've personally seen that was complete in the box, sans a warranty card and one sticker, so I snagged it on the spot since I knew I probably was not going to see one of these things for a while, as they are not common. It's not often you see them pop up on eBay, or even Yahoo for that matter, and when they do, it's usually just a bare circuit board, which I guess isn't a huge deal considering there isn't much use for the box and floppy now, as you can find copies of the contents of both online, but I like owning them because they're cool and they look nice and they make me feel good. While the limited use of the board, the difficulty of finding them, and the equipment needed to use one is a pretty huge drawback that makes it really difficult for me to recommend one, I am personally happy to own one. It's a fascinating piece of music history that, while perhaps not particularly versatile, has its own unique character to it that makes it interesting to use, and for some people, it might just be exactly what they're looking for.